Hello, Psychomotivation. How are you guys today? That good, huh? I'm glad to hear it. Let's talk about the self and the self-strivings, if you will. This is chapter 10. So we have kind of gone over the precipice. We've gone over the peak. We're on the downside of the course now, about halfway through. Can you imagine such a thing? Well, let us then move through this. Actually, we're a little bit beyond halfway as far as our material. Let's talk about the self. Why not? From what I've heard, everyone's got one. Oh, God. Psychologists tell the worst jokes, and I consider myself part of that club. Let us talk about William James. William James, 1890, writes the 2-volume work, Principles of Psychology, a chapter dedicated to the self. And I think William James gives us some interesting perspective on the self. Fascinating thing about James' book is you can pick that book up today, and I have a copy. You can pick up that book today, and you can read any chapter, the chapter on the self, chapter on emotions, what have you, and you can generate testable hypotheses from what James was talking about 120, 130 years ago. The breadth of theory in the book is truly astounding. So, William James, let's begin with the two selves then. He posits there's two selves, and there's the me. This is the self as known. So when I talk about myself, when I think about myself, in James' vernacular, I'm thinking about me, right? This is the empirical ego. It's the sum total of all that I can call mine. And that includes my possessions then. So the material possessions. This shirt, right? You like it? I just got this from Land's End. It was on sale. Shipping was free. Flannel shirts around $16. I'm like, all about a bargain. Normally $54, which I think would be an awful lot to pay for this shirt. But if you want to sell me this shirt for $16 and free shipping, I'm on board. So the material me, right? That's part of the self, right? The social me, and how I interact with others and with whom I interact. That's part of me. That's the social me. And then this is spiritual me. This is the part of me that maybe derives meaning or purpose that connects me to something larger than myself, right? From the self, then those aspects of the self, James also says that there's feelings aroused regarding the self, like self-appreciation, and all else being equal, we tend to want to appreciate the self, look upon ourselves favorably. Now notice people with clinical depression, in fact, tend to do the opposite, but clinical depression is a psychopathology, right? So for those who are not suffering psychopathology, not suffering clinical depression, then the feelings aroused would typically be self-appreciation. Self-seeking is an act that many people take on. So the average person, right, wants to understand more about themselves to a certain extent. And self-preservation. They want to maintain these aspects of the self. They want to protect them from attack. So, but who knows all this? And this is if it's tricky at all, this is the tricky point right here. So let's sit with this for a minute. Who knows all this about me? Who knows the me? Who's wondering about the me? Who the hell is speaking about the me? And that's the I. So the two selves that William James is saying is this is the product of who I become. This is me. But who has awareness of me? I. So I has awareness of the me. A strange language convention, but I is the self as the knower, the pure ego, right? So the I knows about the me, the I evaluates the me, the I can answer the question, hey, how you doing? And the evaluation comes from the I. So it's this bifurcated self, this two-piece self, and it just becomes, it was a philosophical necessity thousands of years ago and verbalized nicely by William James. Hi, Rosie. Rosie's mad at me. She was at the vet. She had to spend the night. She got some teeth pulled because her teeth were bad. And now she has to have medication twice a day. And a lot of cats don't like to take medication. So she is looking at me with great suspicion. She got me good today. man, she scratched the hell out of me when I was putting the medication in her mouth. That's kind of the way it goes when you have cats that are half feral, right? So the self then, 4 topics taking center stage. What do we know about the self? Defining or creating the self. Relating the self to society. Discovering and developing personal potential. And then managing or regulating the self. And you know, we've talked a lot about self-regulation, and guess what? We're probably not done yet with that. Rosie, you want to come here? That's a big no, thank you very much. 6 dimensions of psychological well-being. Self-acceptance, right? And so much self-help and self-help. So much, many self-help works, right? Which are not empirically well supported typically. But self-acceptance, right, is an important quality. Accepting who we are for who we are, right? Positive relations with others, right, is a dimension of psychological well-being. A sense of autonomy. And notice that we vary in this as it relates to our psychological well-being, but certainly has come to us from previous chapters. Environmental mastery, and in this sense of being engaging in mastery and its attendant concept of self-efficacy, right? Developing a purpose in life, having a reason for being, right? And then experiencing personal growth. And you can see that as we move through the course, we're moving into a more positive or humanistic psychology type flavored course. And we'll see that with increasing frequency as we discuss ideas throughout the course. So 5 validated sources of self-esteem. And these are honest to God. This isn't faux self-esteem like they tried with the self-esteem movement when children were in grade school and they give you gold stars for showing up and stuff like that. But these are validated sources of self-esteem. Secure attachments in interpersonal relationship lends to, is demonstrably, has been empirically supporting enhancements to self-esteem. Positive reflected appraisals, how others see and evaluate me. And think about this, the looking glass self that Margaret Mead talked about, that people reflect back to us how we're doing. So when I engage in interactions and then I watch the person with whom I'm interacting, right, as they bounce the self back to me, I can get an appraisal of I'm doing well or I'm doing poorly, right? Positive social comparisons, and Leon Fessenger was all about social comparison theory, and that is when data doesn't exist to evaluate my performance, I will compare my performance to the performance of another. And if I'm coming out on top, positive social comparisons will yield self-esteem. Specific competencies we possess that are valued not just by us, but by others, but by society, right, is a source of self-esteem. And then finally, the creation of positive social identities, right, will also serve to enhance our self-evaluation. Our self-evaluation is our self-esteem, okay? So, self-esteem examples, sources, well, okay. Secure attachments. Remember when we talked about Harry Harlow and his rhesus monkeys? As I mentioned, the looking glass self, positive self comparisons, right? Now, the nasty feature of self-comparison is, what if you're on the lower end of the self-comparison, that is, there's a self-comparison going on and someone exceeds you, then it can actually be devastating to the self-esteem, right? And Fessenger pointed that out, and later Abraham Tesser actually developed a hypothesis around that has a lot of support. The personal value or worth, back from William James. And then positive social identity. This one I'm going to say yes and no. Social identity is a tricky aspect. The problem with social identity is my social identity, I'm a member of a group, right? So that's my social identity. I'm a member of this group. But what that involves then is me comparing my group to another group, and usually then that group has to be diminished in its evaluation for me to feel good about myself. But then there's evidence too that belonging to any group enhances self-esteem, even if it's not a societally valued group. So that last one, There's evidence yes and evidence no. Let's move on to the self-concept. What is it? Well, it's a cognitive structure. It's a schema. It's the self-schema, if you will, the self-concept, right? And this is something that we start building as children and build on throughout our life. It's a set of beliefs that the individual uses to conceptualize his or herself, right? And it's often a cluster of domain-specific self-schemas. So in this case, I probably have a teacher self. I have a pet companion self. I have a spousal self. I have these different selves, right? And all these sub-selves then comprise the larger self. In some selves, I perform better than other selves. And then I might attach different levels of importance based on my performance in these selves. Okay, so the self-schemas, they're a reflection of invariance people have discovered about their own social behavior. So it becomes kind of the story of who we are and linked to our self-evaluations. Now, what are some of the benefits of a well-developed self-schema? Well, to the extent that my self-schema is robust, is well-developed, I process information about the self more readily and more easily. And that's what a schema does, is allow us to organize and process information efficiently, right? We confidently predict the future behavior in a given domain. So, and I've been through this, let's pick on the teaching domain for a little while. The most recent course that I've added to my repertoire at Ohio State, it was Psych of Emotion. And it's like, all right, Mark, what do you think? Would you like to teach psychology of emotion? And I'm like, well, I've taken on a lot of new courses when I've been at Columbus State or Ohio State. So my self-schema as a teacher says, yeah, you're willing to take on new courses. That's not a problem. You develop new courses all the time. And then as a researcher, emotion was the area that I researched for my dissertation. So I felt pretty well prepared, right? So I'm confidently predict that my behavior, my ability to teach psychology of emotion, or this class, psychology of motivation, my belief in my ability is relatively robust based on my past experience, and that is all part of my self-schema within that domain, right? Now, a well-developed self-schema allows us to resist counter-schematic information about the self. So if people come at you with information that says, no, you don't do well, if I have a robust self-concept, self-schema, and it's supported by a lot of evidence, then the slings and arrows that people hurl at me just kind of bounce off because I know better, right? So that's another aspect. I'm not insecure about my teaching ability. So what people say has less and less impact as a result of that. And then I can quickly retrieve self-related behavioral evidence from that domain. So I can drum up memories of experiences of teaching quite readily because I have a robust self-schema in that area, in that domain. Now, Contingency of Self-Worth then describes how important a given self is, a given domain of self, if you will. Performance in some domains is really important to us and has a huge impact on our self-esteem. So for me, teaching would be highly important and highly evaluative of myself. But performance then is more closely linked to our self-esteem. That's important to our identity. So I identify strongly as a teacher. I have a robust teacher self-schema. My performance then in teaching becomes really important. Contrast that to someone who's 5'8", hit 5'6", 5'7" in middle school. I was about that height. By the time I achieved 13, 14 years old, pretty much the height I was going to be. And like many middle school boys, we love to play sports. But it became obvious by the time I hit middle school that basketball was not going to be my sport of favor. I wasn't particularly coordinated for basketball, didn't have a really good eye, but the height is really an obstacle, right? when you're short on the basketball court, you better bring something really special to the game, or you're just not going to excel. And I didn't excel. So what are my choices? Should I look like a fool on the basketball court and continue to pursue that as an important aspect of the self? Or should I begin to minimize the basketball self to a greater and greater degree, and thus protect my self-esteem? Find things that I'm good at and do more of that. Find things I'm not so good at and do less of that, right? So the self emerges, that is, I engage in selves that bring me self-esteem, that bring me success, and I try to minimize my performance in areas where I'm not as successful. Right? So poor performance then on the basketball court, since I don't have a basketball player self-concept of any notion, I can now play basketball with people and you know, I'm not good. They can see I'm not good. I know I'm not good, but we laugh and have a good time. And I don't take a personal hit on my self-esteem because I've determined that what I do on this basketball court is for fun, and it's not important, and it's not indicative of me, of myself, of the quality, my quality as a human being. Right, Annika? I don't attach a lot of importance to being able to jump up places that are, 3 times taller than I am, right? It's not something I do. I would just hurt myself. So jumping high is not a domain in which I evaluate myself. Annika, on the other hand, jumps pretty damn well. So I think it's important for her self-concept, right? You can tell she's showing off. So let's move on to the motivational properties then of self-schema, because we kind of had to get there, right? Because this is a course on motivation, not a course strictly on the self. Remember, Ohio State has a bomb of a course offered by the psychology department on the self, a whole course just on the self. So if it interests you as a topic, man, sign up for that, right? So, consistent self-schema is direct behavior to confirm the self-view and, right, to prevent episodes that generate feedback that might disconfirm that self-view. So again, it makes my view of myself more robust and less situationally dependent, right? Now, the possible self, and we're going to talk about, we've talked about the me, we've talked about the I. We're going to talk about a couple different theorists in this class who have a couple different self labels. So let's begin with this one, a possible self. It's a self-schema that generates motivation to move the present self towards a desired future self. And I've always thought as a kid, even back when I was a kid approaching, middle school, I was the editor of the school newspaper in junior high. I was the editor of the student newspaper in high school. I was opinion editor of the school newspaper in high school. Writing has always been kind of something that I did. Right? And so it's a component of the self, and since then, writing a master's thesis, writing a dissertation, etc., writing papers for classes, etc., one of the possible selves that I've always kind of held on to, ever since I was a kid, was becoming a writer, and write a couple books. And that is a possible self. And now that I'm at this point in my career, I start thinking, maybe it's time for me to start to transition from teacher to author, right? So author is a possible self, and I consider this, and it has some motivational perks to it, right? And I consider it to a greater and greater extent. So notice how this possible self can motivate me to make certain life choices or start gradually making adjustments to the way I perceive myself and what I believe to be important, what I am motivated to invest my time in to perhaps achieve that possible self. What do you think? You like that idea? So, how do you feel about a model? Let's play with this model here. I know, it looks nasty, doesn't it? But it'll be all right. Right, it'll be fine. So, let us then take a look here. We have a preference for self-conformatory feedback. Let's look at that right at the top there. And what the hell does that mean? That means I like to hear stories about myself that confirm who I want to be or who I believe myself to be. So if you say things that are consistent with my view of the self, right? If you say, Mark, I really enjoyed the way you taught that course and I believe myself to be a good teacher, then those two things are consistent. And your feedback to me under those circumstances is confirmatory. So I'm saying, well, thank you for that. That makes me feel good because that's what I'm trying to do. And that self is really important to me. So, but we seek this out all the time. And you know that you ask people, if you consider yourself a good cook, what do you do when you serve a meal? You ask people, how do you like it? You like that? You think that's good? Right? Because we do this routine self-verification. Am I behaving like the self? Right? And if the self-confirmatory or non-potent self-discrepant feedback, right, if it's good, that is, we're good, the verification, it confirms the self, yeah, all is awesome, right? Or if it's non-potent self-discrepant feedback. So I do the self-verification and you say, Mark, I've never seen anyone miss as many free throws on the basketball court as you do. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. I suck. Now you know why I'm not in the NBA. Well, a million reasons for that, right? But so notice that's self-discrepant feedback, but it's non-potent. It has no impact. I have no contingency of self-worth there. Are you turning into a maniac, Annika? Huh? All right. So let's suppose we do some routine self-verification. We get potent self-discrepant feedback or choice point. In this case, potent self-discrepant feedback. Oh my God, Mark, that is the worst course I've ever taught. I mean, that's the worst course I've ever taken, that course you taught, right? Well, the certainty of self-concept, if it's low, right, then I'm going to have to change my self-concept. I'm going to be thinking about maybe I'm not cut out to be a teacher. So I get this negative feedback. My self-concept is weak, right? Well, that makes that discrepant feedback even more potent and can motivate a job change, right? Some change in the self-concept, right? But let's suppose the self-discrepant feedback comes at me, what a horrible course, the certainty of self-concept is moderate, then I might have a crisis of self-verification, right? And it's like, oh my God, I don't know, am I doing okay or not, right? And then we get potent discrepant feedback, right? The certainty of self-concept, I start to erode my belief. My belief in my teaching skill was moderate here, but I get further self-discrepant feedback, right, or ambiguous feedback, then my self-concept can become low and low and low. But let's look at the protective aspects here. Boy, that was a shitty course. And I say, well, I don't know what you're talking about because I taught it well and I'm a good teacher, right? And then, in fact, we lead to a strengthening of the self-concept, or at least no deterioration in it. Questions about that? So really, look at the major factors, right? And think about the looking glass self, if you will, right? Here is the feedback area, and if the feedback is negative and the self-concept is weak, it can force a change. If it's moderate, and there's further discrepant feedback, it's probably going to force a change. But if my concept is moderate, right, and I get self-confirmatory feedback, or I have high self-concept, then my self-concept remains intact. So we have to be careful, and I think often, especially when we're thinking in terms of relationships, the quality of feedback we get from our partner in a relationship, is this person enhancing our self-concept, or are they diminishing and consistently attacking our self-concept? And then, is it legit or is it not? And there are some people who are just not nice. There are some people who like to put others down. And if we have a relatively weak self-concept and we've partnered up or we're working for someone who likes to put others down, note that can force a self-concept change. But if we're secure in ourselves and we get this discrepant feedback from someone, after a while we may just then determine that their feedback is not welcome, not useful, or maybe working for this person or partnering with this person is not a good choice for us. So note that the maintenance of self and the protection of self can have its own motivational qualities in this regard. Questions? Sit with this. It's not as complicated as, I know it's a lot of boxes, but it's really a lot of boxes that are only representing three ideas. Okay? Oh, you're back. Well. Oh, you're showing off your jumping? Is that because I said that you're such an excellent jumper you decided you're going to show off for everyone and get down and continue to jump back up? Let's talk about a mind-blowing motivational aspect of the self. This is Bill Swan, University of Texas at Austin is where he hung out. And he says that we seek out situations where we can be the self. And you say, well, okay. Why wouldn't I seek out situations? How can I be a teacher without a classroom? So if the teacher self is a huge component, it's huge important to my self-concept, is the domain of teaching. And this is one thing that frightens me about maybe retiring. What if I retire and then I'm knocking around the house or wherever it is and I don't have my classroom anymore? Then I'm kind of, that's part of the problem of retirement, is you give up this aspect of the self. You say, I'm retiring from this portion of the self. What is going to be the consequence of that? Because, you know, Bill Swan says we seek out situations where one can be oneself. And without a classroom, it becomes difficult to be a teacher, or without an online classroom. But you get the idea, right? Comfort is derived from being a familiar self, and if you suddenly give that up, then what do you got? You got to generate this new self, and that equals anxiety, uncertainty, and all that bad stuff. But here is the irony of what Bill Swan was initially pondering, researching, and theorizing. Why is it that people have been in abusive relationships often return to those relationships or enter into new abusive relationships? And this happens with great frequency. You would think that someone who's been knocked around in a relationship, let's suppose they're being physically abused, they're being harmed, they're actually physically being knocked around by a violent partner. Why are they more likely than not to end up in another abusive relationship or return to the formerly abusive relationship? And here's the irony. Swan says, look, if you're in an abusive relationship as a child, right, you're more likely to be found in an abusive relationship as an adult than a non-abused child would be as an adult, right? He says you develop an abusee self. You develop a self that is suited to being abused, is used to being abused, and that's kind of the way one learns to live their life. They adapt to the abuse. Now you enter into a loving relationship where there's no abuse, and it's like you don't have a self created that's appropriate or consistent with a non-abusive environment. That's frickin' weird, and that's frickin' fascinating. So William Swan really proposed a fascinating irony to us about selves. Now, we'll move through here. We got a couple different self-theorists to talk about, so maybe some somewhat abrupt transitions. I want to return to this notion of possible selves. And this is the representation, right, of potential attributes, characteristics, abilities that the self does not yet possess but could possess, that these are in the realm of possibilities. And the possible selves are especially pertinent to people in college, because you come to college, right, for many of us who go to college, it's to explore what we could possibly become. We enter college maybe with not a firm knowledge, But we're hoping by the end of those 4 years that we have kind of a clear picture of where we want to go, which implies who we want to be. What type of self are we crafting? Now, possible selves are mostly social in origin, and I'll bet you might have partners, parents, siblings, friends who are more than willing to tell you what possible self you should be, right? A lot of people lined up to say, hey, you ought to do this, you ought to do that. When I was a kid, I was growing up, I argued a lot. So what do you think everyone's told me I should be? What do people who like to argue do? They become attorneys, right? They become lawyers. You ought to be a lawyer. You like to argue so much. You ought to be, you ought to be, you ought to be, right? Well, so possible self, well, let's get there, right? It's the possible self's motivational role to link the present self with ways to become the possible self. So it's like, wow, this possible self looks pretty interesting. It might even be an ideal self. More on that later. How do I get from the current self to that self, right? And then this lays out a pathway. And the level of appeal of that possible self really has the motivational quality to it. Now, an important piece of the puzzle in understanding how people develop is their realm of potential possible selves. Now, this portrays the self as a dynamic entity with a past. This is who I was, this is who I've become, and then it implies that I can become further, right? Now, let's talk about Tori Higgins here for a minute. Tori Higgins is, well, when I was in graduate school, we encountered Tori Higgins actually came and spoke at our colloquium here at Ohio State. And we all had to read our share of research articles by Tori Higgins. And I don't think there's a 15-letter word that Tori Higgins isn't in love with. I found Tori Higgins amazingly challenging to read. He would regularly send me to the thesaurus to say, what the hell is this? What the hell is this? And by the time you think you're in graduate school, you probably think you have a pretty robust vocabulary. Well, Higgins writes very complexly, let's put it that way. But some very profound theories from Higgins. So these self-guides and emotion, and he linked the two up, and I think that's the profound aspect of what he did, was linking self and emotion within this theory. What he's talking about here is there's potential mismatches. What's critical is when the selves don't line up. And Higgins comes at us with three selves. The actual self, and that one's pretty self-explanatory. This is who I actually believe or perceive myself to be at this moment in time. The two selves, then the other two selves beyond the actual self, is the ought self, the self I referred to on the previous slide. You oughta, yada, yada, yada. How many people have told you what you ought to do, right? And then that's generated by others typically. You ought to. Now we may internalize the ought. That is, the ought is an external advice, you ought to, but then if we come to believe it, we might internalize it. We might find ourselves saying you ought to, saying it to ourselves, kind of in concert with the people from the outside saying it externally. So you oughta, right? Now, the other self, self number 3 then in Tori Higgins' world, is the ideal self. And this is who ideally we would love to become. So notice this is a possible self, but so is the oughta self as a possible self. So there's this kind of constrained you oughta self or this imaginary dreamer ideal self, right? Well, what happens when they don't line up? What happens when they're discrepant, right? So an actual self, ought self mismatch, and this is where the emotional component comes in. Mismatches between actual and ought often lead to anxiety-related emotions. That is, I'm not measuring up. And now notice that we might become worried that our parents have said, you ought to do this, you ought to do this, you ought to go get your college degree. Well, what if I fail? What if I don't do well? What if I don't meet their expectations? And we begin to feel anxious, right? And the cluster of anxiety-related emotions are a result of that mismatch. Now, the actual ideal self, on the other hand, the ideal self is generated by us. and it's a possible self that would be ideal. If you could be anything in the world, what would you want to be? You answer that question, you're talking about the ideal self more often than not, right? Mismatch is there if who I am is not measuring up, or at least on the clear path to my ideal. Then I have dejection-related emotions, most typified by sadness and or depression. Okay? So, discrepant selves lead to emotional outcomes, predictably. And those emotional outcomes depend on whether we're comparing the actual self to an ought or an actual self to an ideal. Profound work by Higgins, right? You take a component like the self and potential and then talk about emotional reactions. Now, another component to Higgins, let's add one more element in, is promotion focus versus prevention focus. And we've talked about something similar to this, not in terms of the self directly, which we're going to do now. Promotion focus is approaching the goal, the desired self, essentially moving forward. So, someone who's engaging or has a promotion focus, this is who I am, that's who I want to be, and I'm going to do what I can to make that journey. That is, so I'm moving forward. That's the promotion focus. The prevention focus, on the other hand, is avoiding failure, avoiding further mismatch. It's essentially moving backward or remaining stationary. So it's an unwillingness to give up the current self, right, to move towards the potential self. And we can notice, and Higgins has demonstrated, that people have individual differences in this regard. Some of us are more promotion focused. Some of us are more prevention focused. And think about this in terms of, let's mishmash it, if you will, with another concept. Mastery versus performance. And you can see, give it some time, but you can see how these concepts are at least slightly interrelated. Okay? So promotion focus, I'm going to come up here, I'm going to master that material, and I'm going to become the doctor. I'm going to become the writer. I'm going to become the attorney. I'm going to realize my ideals, right? Prevention focus, on the other hand, is, man, just let me perform well enough to get by, right? So that I don't further embarrass myself or I don't fail. Profound thinking in terms of Higgins. I especially love the blending of the emotion and the self. So, another self-theorist, Leon Fessenger. Now, Leon Fessenger gave us social comparison theory, which we described a little earlier in this lecture. That is, how am I doing? Well, let me compare myself to others around me, and either I'm outperforming or underperforming, and then that informs me about myself, the quality of my performance, which then affects my self-esteem, right? Well, interesting, profound theory from Leon Fessenger, but probably not the one he's best known for, right, Annika? What's he best known for? Cognitive dissonance, if you will. And now cognitive dissonance is a state of tension, right? Whenever one holds two simultaneously inconsistent cognitions. Now these can be ideas, they can be beliefs, they can be evaluation of behavior. The point is that dissonance is when there's a mismatch. So if I believe stealing is wrong, but then I steal something, my belief system says stealing is wrong, but my behavior of stealing, it's inconsistent, right? And what Fessenger is saying is, when we hold two inconsistent attitudes, like I love smoking, but smoking is going to kill me, right? Or stealing is wrong, but I just cheated on my taxes, right? And remember, if you cheat on your taxes, you're stealing. You're not paying your fair share, right? This creates a tension. This creates a form of anxiety. Now, some of us might call that anxiety or that tension guilt. I feel guilty for doing something against my values. I feel guilty for doing the wrong thing. Now, this is a huge motivational theory, because what Fessenger is saying is that guilt feeling manifests itself as a physical discomfort. I mean, an actual physical sensation in the pit of one's stomach. This feeling of anxiety, this feeling of sick to my stomach. And Fessenger says that motivates me to rectify the inconsistency. So let's give an example. I think stealing is wrong. I think contributing to the greater good is right. So let's take those two value systems. And then I turn around and I cheat on my taxes. And I say, well, taxes are to contribute to the greater good. At least one might think so. And taxes are required, and it's spelled out what I owe. And I have now done something funny to make the government think that my income is lower, so my tax burden is lower, and I'm paying less tax than I actually need to. Boy, I feel guilty about that. So what am I motivated to do? Well, I somehow have to bring this in line. So I either have to come clean and redo my taxes and do them on the legit, and I can say, okay, so now I feel okay because I'm doing it honestly. Or I might tell myself some stories that justify my cheating. And that is, well, everybody cheats on their taxes, so why shouldn't I? In fact, I'd be an idiot if I didn't, if everyone else does. So now what I'm saying is, well, a little cheating is not a big deal, because if you don't cheat, then you're just a fool and an idiot. Or I might say, well, actually, it's not cheating. These are deductions that are at least reasonably legitimate, I believe, right? Or I might say, what the hell am I so wound up about my tax burden anyway, since the government just spends the money foolishly, or they waste it on, $150 hammers, or the government is so rife with cheating, everybody does it, right? So I just cook up all these justifications, and the justifications then say, hey, it's okay that I did this. Hey, Penelope. And therefore it reduces my dissonance. It's okay that I did what I did. I'm making excuses for it. I'm providing rationalizations, right? And it's somehow okay. It reduces the conflict at that point. Now, what are some of the elements that might arouse dissonance? Well, choices are inherently dissonance-inducing, right? Well, let's suppose I want to buy a car. And back in the day, I got an 88 Firebird in the 90s. I bought it used. A beautiful car. I love my 88 Firebird formula. My buddy, he had an 86 Camaro Z28. And we used to go back and forth, what's better, Firebird or Camaro? They were made in the same factory, so I don't know what the story was that we were telling each other. But let's suppose that I want to choose. I'm going to buy a car, and there's this Firebird and there's this Camaro. And I say, well, which should I choose? And it's like, the deal is, choices, if I make the wrong choice, then it makes me look foolish, or it makes me look uninformed, it makes me look stupid. So I want to make the right choice. But as soon as I make the choice, how do I know I made the right choice? Because now I'm afraid if I realize I made the wrong choice, then I'm a dumbass, right? So what do? In the case of choices, what Fessenger says we do is, now that I've chosen the Firebird and foregone the choice of the Camaro, I will go seek out information that shows that the Firebird is a superior choice and that the Camaro would have been a poorer choice. So what I initially thought was an even choice, in fact, I spread the alternatives, making my choice look more desirable and the other choice less desirable. That provides me comfort. Boy, I'm a good chooser. And doesn't threaten my self-esteem. So, value behavior, inconsistency, if I steal, right? But I think stealing is wrong, that's another that will cause the dissonance. Insufficient justification is something that many of us lecturers are dealing with now. Why do I keep teaching more and more students? Why do I create more and more assignments for the same pay? That is, the justification for doing all this extra work doesn't seem to be supported. So then I have to reconcile that disparity, right? That causes dissonance. Discovery of new dissonance-arousing information about the self, others, processes. So I try to tell myself stories that reduce the conflict, and that's the motivational property of. So it can cause us to do a lot of cognitive gymnastics, right? Now, Fessenger came out with the theory of cognitive dissonance in the 1950s, and what happens is often people look at these profound theories but then go on to say, does it work all the time? Are there exceptions? Does it work with some people and not with others? What is the actual process? Can we have some more detail, please? And I want to show you a model here. The necessary conditions for the arousal of dissonance and the subsequent motivation created to reduce the dissonance. So here we're going to start with a behavior. And the first step in the process then is there's some unwanted negative consequence. So I say something that, let's say, hurts someone's feelings. And I think, but Mark, you're a nice guy, but you really hurt that person's feelings, right? Well, okay. Am I responsible? This is step 2. And I look, well, if I wasn't responsible, that if I had to say it or if I was forced to say it, then it's not my responsibility. I'm not going to experience dissonance. The arousal of dissonance won't occur, right? One of the famous examples here is a book called Ordinary Men by Browning, and it was looking at the people in the police reserve battalions that went into Poland, for example, as the Nazis took over Poland, right? The Wehrmacht, the army keeps moving forward. They're on their way to Russia. I mean, they're going for it, right? But then what do we do with the civilian population that's left behind? And we bring in these police reserve battalions, and these people were directed to round up and exterminate the Jews. Well, you can imagine this is probably a pretty tough job because most of us don't consider ourselves bloodthirsty killers of innocent women and children. But my job as a police reserve battalion member, I've spent the day killing Jewish women and children. At the end of the day, what do I tell myself? Say, well, I'm not a murderer of innocent people, but my behavior kind of indicates that I just killed like 78 people today. How do I reconcile those? Well, the thing is, if I didn't do it, I would be court-martialed and shot. So I was forced to do it. I didn't do it by choice. Therefore, I don't have to take personal responsibility, and it allows me to escape the dissonance creation mechanisms. But let's suppose that it is my fault. I understand it was my personal responsibility, and I went ahead and did it. Well, this is the antecedent condition. This sets up the dissonance process. Antecedent means it comes before. So now that dissonance is aroused, the dissonance, like I said earlier, causes physiological arousal. Well, do I attribute that arousal to the behavior? And this is, because I feel this sickness in the pit of my stomach about what I've done. But what if I said, you know what? Lunch looked pretty sketchy today, and what if this feeling in my stomach is not the result of the conflict, but is the result of food poisoning? I know, it sounds strange, but the physiological arousal that I'm experiencing can now be explained not by dissonance, but by eating a bad meal, right? But let's suppose that in fact I'm at the point where I say, you know what? No, that feeling in the pit of your stomach, that is from the conflict. There's no escaping it. Then finally, that creates the motivation to reduce the dissonance. So, you take a simple model like cognitive dissonance, but Cooper and Fazio say, yeah, we buy it, but there is a step-by-step process that shows. And notice, if I don't believe I've created an unwanted negative consequence, then there'll be no dissonance. If I don't believe I was responsible, there will be no dissonance to reduce. But if I do experience the dissonance, and I do experience the dissonance, I attribute it to the behavior I committed, I will finally be motivated to reduce the dissonance. So there's an awful lot of ways to get out of cognitive dissonance, and that was one of the fascinating areas of this research. So, alternative splitting, I talked about in terms of the automobiles. One is better than the others. One way that we can escape dissonance often is, hey, I promise to be good. I know I messed up this time, or I know I did this time, but I'll never do it again in the future, so I'm good to get out of it. I can deny choice or responsibility, as we described. I can remove the dissonant belief, that is, there's nothing wrong with cheating on taxes. It's okay. Cheating on taxes isn't stealing at all. Cheating on taxes is a time-honored American tradition, right? So now no dissonance, okay? Or I can add a new consonant belief. Well, you know, there's a little good and bad in all of us, and this just happens to be the day when I demonstrated the bad. Or I can increase the importance of the consonant belief that perhaps everybody does it. Hello everybody. So we finished our discussion on cognitive dissonance. Let's shift our conversation to identity. And what do we know about identity? And remember, we're talking identity in terms of its motivational properties and perhaps its motivational consequences. So identity, and it derives from social relationships because our identity is an exchange. It's built from exchange with others, at least to many psychological theorists. It's the means by which the self relates to society. So this is who I am, and this is, you know, how I relate to those around me. They share their identities, I share my identity. It captures the essence of the self, and this is done, though, within a cultural context. So it's the hidden hand of culture has a profound effect on perhaps which identities are allowed to us more readily, and which identities, you know, could in fact be prohibited to us or more difficult to maintain at the very least. Once people assume social roles, mother, bully, etc., or if you remember Zimbardo's Stanford prison study, or demonstration, if you will, guard versus prisoner, right? Their identities direct their behaviors in ways that express the role identity's cultural value. So we get put into, you know, we're born into a culture, we develop an identity within that culture, and the identity then provides opportunities, but just as much it constrains what's available to us. The identity directs the person to pursue some behaviors, and these are typically identity confirming behaviors. That is, I behave in concert with my identity, and I avoid other behaviors which would be then counterproductive in terms of the cultural definition of the identity I'm trying to assume. Now, that being said, let us consider Dr. Brewer, Marilyn Brewer, and one of her graduate students, Cindy Pickett, and certainly I have a very close relationship with Dr. Brewer and many fond memories. Dr. Brewer, Marilyn, was my advisor for the last three and a half years that I was in graduate school here at Ohio State. When Phil Tetlock left in my third year, he asked, do you want to go to Berkeley with me? And I'm like, you know, I think I'm good here. There's a lot of reasons that I've already become embedded. Berkeley sounds cool, but Berkeley also sounds expensive, and shifting from social psych to business school probably isn't in the cards. So as Phil leaves, I walk down the hallway down to Marilyn's office, and she says, oh, about time you got here. So what's going on, Marilyn? She says, well, you need an advisor, don't you? And I'm like, I sure do, Marilyn. And she says, well, sign on then. Here we go. And Marilyn shepherded me through. I took several courses with Marilyn, but as much as anything, my time with Marilyn was spent producing my dissertation. And what a fantastic dissertation advisor Marilyn was. So I owe her, you know, a debt of thanks that will be never ending. So one of her theories, and she's had a long career in social psychology, one of her theories she developed was the theory of optimal distinctiveness. And what does this mean? Well, Marilyn says that we're caught in this tension, and a tension is often the result of two different motivations that can be in conflict. The conflict in this case is, I want to be like my role suggests I should be. I want to fit in. I want to be a part of. I want to be included. But at the same time, I want to be seen as an individual. So it's this weird balance, right, Annika, between being a member of a group, like you are, with the other cats here, but at the same time you want to maintain your individuality. So Marilyn calls this optimal distinctiveness. Yes, I want to be recognized as a group member, but within that group I want to be recognized as being distinct. So you can see this fundamental tension, and often this causes us to be motivated to behave like others, but other times what becomes more important is that we behave as an individual. So really, it's a factor underlying the selection and the strength of social identities at any given moment, right? So optimum distinctiveness really suggests that there's this fundamental tension, as I was describing, to be unique, but to be as one with others. And what happens, and Marilyn's done a lot of research in optimal distinctiveness theory. Not only did she develop the theory, but then a lot of her graduate students pick up the task of demonstrating, providing evidence through hypothesis testing. And obviously Dr. Pickett was one of those who really ran with this. So there's two fundamental human needs, if we want to simplify, that derive out of this. There's the need to be assimilated, part of the group, but there's the need to be differentiated as well. Let's think about then the opportunities to be ourselves, that is, to choose an identity that allows us to do both. And what it is, you know, we have low and high for inclusion, right? And then we have the need, the assimilation, right, and the differentiation. The ultimate space then is that space right in the center where we're enough alike but enough different that we find a balance between these needs. And think about that. How many times are we often put in a position where our optimal functioning seems to be when we achieve that balance point? So finding a career, for example, that allows you to be a member of a group, but at the same time be an individual within that group. And I think I'm pretty lucky as a lecturer at Ohio State. I'm embedded in a group, so I'm included in that group. We have weekly, voluntary meetings. We don't have to go to these meetings. We go because we like to be included. But, if you listen to people speak in this group in our meetings, it's clear that we're all very distinct individuals and really enjoy our individuality and our autonomy, right? So we get back to that basic need of autonomy. Well, but the relationships and the inclusion, so balancing those out. So you can see how this might affect a person's motivation to participate in one group, but maybe diminish their participation in another group because it doesn't satisfy this optimal distinctiveness need. Now, affect control theory. Identity confirming behaviors, right? These are fundamental sentiment confirming behaviors. We engage in these behaviors, and we also engage in identity restoring behaviors when we stray too far from what we consider or our culture considers successful demonstration and participation in that identity. So motivation and emotion both kind of are at the heart of both of these. So in affect control theory, people behave in a way to minimize this affective deflection, right? Affective deflections energize behavior, so when people act in an identity conflicting way, affective deflection occurs. That is, I am not right. I'm not right with who I need to be, right? It causes us to then engage in identity restoring behaviors, figuring out ways to demonstrate that we're a part of to the others and to ourselves, kind of bringing us back into line, or being brought back into the fold is an old-fashioned cliche, right? So we stray a little bit, right? We may, wander off as that black sheep element of us says, you need to go and do your own thing. But at some time we find that maybe that wasn't necessarily what we needed to do, or we didn't need to do it to that extent. So then we're brought back into the fold. We're brought back into the flock, so to speak. Now, agency, the self is an action developed from within. It's an innate process of motivation. So the self as action and development from within, what we're talking about is we possess this core self, right? It's energized by innate motivation directed by the inherent developmental process of differentiation and integration as described in optimal distinctiveness theory. Note how important, if we go all the way back to the beginning of the lecture when we talk about William James and the selves, right? And William James said something interesting, that a man has as many selves as people with whom he interacts, right? So you can see where it's a complicated path that we choose in maintaining our agency. That is, we interact with all these various groups who may have various views or perceptions of our identity, what it is or what it should be, or both, right? And so we negotiate this very careful balancing act. But it's the agency, it's that core desire to be who we are, right, that is at the heart of this. And this gets us to that term that we've used a couple times, authenticity. Not all self-structures are equally authentic. So sometimes we present a self under certain circumstances that isn't really the core us or the true us, but it's a necessary compromise to, in fact, integrate with that particular group. So other opportunities allow us to more directly reflect the core self, right? And so those might, we find, be more comfortable areas. One piece of advice, if you're looking for unsolicited advice, is if you can find the places in your life, the environments, if you can seek out and maintain and stay in the environments that allow you to be your core self, to be a more authentic self, you'll have better psychological functioning as a result of this. So let's talk about this issue of self-concordance, which is kind of where we're getting at with this. People decide to pursue goals that are congruent, right, or the fancy term concordant with their core self. So like I said, if you can find an environment where you're allowed to be yourself, and even better than being allowed to be yourself is being encouraged to be yourself, right? That the people around you are okay with you as you. That people support your authenticity. Right? People show you unconditional positive regard for who you are. Who said unconditional positive regard? Whose phrase is that? Anyone? That would be Carl Rogers, and he posits that as a basic human need, to be around people who love you for who you are, not who you could be or who they think you should be, right? But who you actually are, right? So the question asked by the self-concordance model is, how do people decide to strive for in their lives, right? So what do we strive for, and how did that come to be? And we got to think that that's probably associated or generated by the core self, right? How does this personal striving process sometimes nurture the self and promote well-being, yet other times go awry and develop maybe psychopathology in its most extreme cases? And consider that again. It's first of all, I got to figure out, I've got to be in touch with the core self, and then I've got to seek out environments or craft environments that allow my core self to be expressed in the most authentic way. Sometimes we're forced into compromise, and we have to present a self that isn't entirely authentic. But if we're, let's say that we allow ourselves to be trapped or kidnapped by life, captured and forced into a situation where we're not allowed to be authentic, not allowed kind of this agentic pursuit of concordant environments to the core self, then we suffer psychologically. So let's think about some of the choices that we can make, and this is where it's important. There are certain choices I can make. There are other aspects of my life that are thrust upon me and I have less choice, or the choices of resisting what's thrust upon me is too extreme for me to kind of think about. The self-concordance then, right, Annika, what we look at is the goal self-concordance. What are the goals that I set for myself, and are these goals concordant with who I am at that core self, right? So to the extent that I set goals that are concordant and allow me to nurture, to experience, to express my authenticity, right, I'm more likely to engage in sustained effort in associated projects. And then what happens is the need-satisfying effort increases. It increases the likelihood of my goal attainment. So goals that we set that are concordant with our authentic self, more readily attained, right? And the changes in well-being are then positive, right? So the goal self-concordance and the goal attainment, right, to the extent that we can create this concordance, then the increase in the positive well-being will be realized. And we can look at then the general outcomes of this. And what we're going to do is look at these aspects here. But what we have is we have the core self-evaluations. Who am I? What am I about? And to the extent that I understand this and I have the freedom to do so, the autonomy to do so, if you will, then I'm likely to set self-concordant goals. And this is something that we learn over time. Sometimes we find that we've done things and we get to a point and say, God, this isn't what I wanted out of life at all. And I got to change this up or it's destroying me mentally, right? So we set self-concordant goals, and this increases the likelihood of goal attainment. And notice when there's self-concordant goals, the payoff for those goals is bigger because they're goals that are concordant with the self. So we see here greater job life satisfaction as a result of it. Right? Now, what are the benefits? Well, we should see increases in self-esteem. We should see increases in our self-efficacy, our belief that we can do, and notice how that's going to facilitate goal attainment in the future to a greater and greater degree. We feel that we're, in fact, we have the power to control aspects of our lives. That is, this locus of control is, we feel a greater and greater internal locus of control. That is, boy, I control the outcomes of my life. I call my shots. And note how this is related to autonomy. And then we see neuroticism, negative psychological effects diminish as a result of this, right? I think Annika likes this idea all around, right? And she's got a lot of self-concordant goals. No, she doesn't have a lot. She has a few. And they're pretty simple. But she's pretty authentic about getting there, aren't you? Okay. So, now, because I haven't tortured you enough with the ideas of self-regulation, let's take a look at another diagram that can torture you a little further. And what we see here is the self-integration and non-integrated action. So to the extent that we become increasingly our own bosses, we become increasingly autonomous, and we increasingly shift our attention from rewards and punishments outside of us to rewards and punishments that are inside of us, and then finally to pursuing things simply because we want to, because it's authentic for us. So we kind of move around this circle. In this case, if someone is engaging, we view them and we see that they're non-integrated action. They're really responding to external mechanisms, environmental pressures. So people that have the power of reward or punishment over us, right, then can use that punishment or reward to create environmental pressures to cause us to act. But notice this is non-integrated action. This has nothing to do with the self and self-concordance unless we're lucky. Because those who are rewarding or punishing us, let's face it, many of them don't give a shit about us. They don't know us. They don't know our core self or our core values. They're just forcing us to dance to their tune. So they apply external pressures. We react to these external pressures, and we conduct non-integrated action. So for those of you who had the people who are amotivated in paper 1, they're living over in this world. But now, as we go counterclockwise here, what we see is introjected. Now, introjected folk, what have they done? They've taken what they've learned about these pressures, these rewards and punishments, but rather than wait for someone else to apply these pressures to them, they apply them to themselves in forms of internal sanctions. Now notice, the causality is still from the outside. But what we're seeing is, with introjected, is I have taken external pressures and introjected them, made the component of the self. Again, I'm still operating on rewards and punishments, but I supply them for myself rather than have them come from the outside. Now, as we move around, we get to the identified, and notice the arrow. This arrow is completely on the outside. This arrow is somewhat on the inside, but it's still, representing non-integrated action. Now, when we see this arrow, it is touching what we're going to call self-integrated action. So, when we get to identified, what we've done is we've adopted the values, and I know we kind of wore out the value of recycling, that I believe that recycling is one of my values, that cleaning up after oneself is kind of like recycling, right? Rather than just tossing my trash out all over the planet or my carbon emissions or whatever else, I'm saying, man, I value this planet, and I value this planet for the people who are going to come after me. I value my children, right? And I value their children. So I see a need for regulations that will maintain the quality of our water, the quality of our air, etc. It becomes a core value. I identify this. Note that this core value now, it's about concordance. Is recycling concordant with who I believe myself to be? Who I believe myself to be, of course, according to William James, is in part my values. So now this identified, notice, I don't need rewards or punishments anymore. What I'm now doing is saying, is this behavior, I evaluate a behavior that I'm about to commit, consistent with my values or not? So we've moved beyond the punishing and the rewarding and just saying, am I concordant, am I consistent with who I want to be? And then finally, we get to the ultimate is the intrinsic motivation, and now this is, I do this because it's the right thing to do and it makes me feel good and I love doing it and I can't imagine not doing it, that I'm intrinsically motivated to do it. So we haven't left these ideas of self-regulation, and as the course moves along, I hope that these become clearer and clearer to you. I know paper 1 was a toughie, and it's designed to be, but it's setting the stage for the application for you as a leader, as we did in paper 1, but now we're moving, as much to understanding the self and engineering a life that will have meaning for you, and you'll find intrinsically motivating to engage in tasks that you value. Okay? So, the cyclical path then for the self-concordance model, goal self-concordance, right? We know that increases sustained effort, as we talked about, and sustained effort makes the likelihood of goal attainment greater, right? It becomes then a need-satisfying experience when we attain that goal. We see increases in well-being, but now what else we see? We see increase in self-concordance. This is that strange process where we grow to become more ourselves. And I promise you, if sometimes you feel that you're not all yourself, that you make a lot of compromises, that in fact, you're kind of bargaining aspects of yourself away to get things that you want in life. At this point, the satisfying nature of the goal attained that you set for yourself that is concordant with you increases your desire for self-concordance, but it also increases your experience of self-concordance. And to that extent, then you sustain the effort because, hey, this is worth it because this is me, right? And often, a lot of us, when we go to graduate school, at first doing studies, taking exams, etc., we're like, but we sustain effort, we maybe publish a paper or run an experiment that works, right? Or we teach a class that is appreciated by the students, etc. And then we then go into this loop and we become more and more a graduate student. We identify with that to a greater extent, and we value the experience to an ever-increasing extent. Okay? Now, one good piece of news is this increases with age. So self-integration increases with age, right? It's consistent with Erik Erikson's 8th developmental stage, ego integrity versus despair. And what this means is when I get to the end of their life, and you know, I went through this a while back. I'm 63 now, but when I hit 50, 50 was a strange age because it's a milestone, and you know how milestones kind of affect us. Many of you, the milestone of 21 has come along, etc., which probably means a lot less than we would have ever thought, but right on. Oh, you're back. All right. But when I hit 50, there's this really weird realization that came upon me. You know, average white male life expectancy somewhere between 75 and 77. It was 77, but over the last 4 or 5 years, what we've seen is life expectancy actually go down in the United States, which is a horrifying statistic to consider, right? But regardless, I hit 50 and I say, okay, 50, and if I'm going to live to 75, let's just play with the round numbers. Okay, 50 to 75. Shit, I've lived 2/3 of my life. I only have a third left. I'm not ready to realize that yet. That kind of sucks, you know. So you begin to value your choices to a greater extent and probably make your choices a little more carefully. Now, there are exceptions. There's a lot of people that will never hit Erikson's 8th stage in terms of ego integrity. That is, I lived a life well. I called my own shots. For the most part, I did what was concordant with my view of myself, right? And you can sit on your rocking chair on the front porch at age 73, rocking back and forth, saying it's a good life, right? Other folks who never really understood or achieved the self-concordance or are always dancing to someone else's drummer, they get to age 70 and they say, shit, there's no taking this back. There's no time to do a do-over. This die has been cast, and I'm stuck with what I got. And that then, Erikson would say, leads to despair. So there's two paths that kind of come towards the end of life, and that is, did I attain my goals? Did I attain psychological well-being? Did I live in a way that I can respect myself having lived that way? Or is my life essentially a story of coulda, woulda, shoulda, largely unsuccessful, and then I descend into despair? So I think that it's often, and this is what led me to quit my job and go to school back when I was about 38, you know, approaching 40, was what am I going to say to myself when I'm on the front porch in the rocking chair? Is my story going to be coulda, woulda, shoulda? Or is my story, hey, pretty good ride, man. You did all right for yourself. You can pat yourself on the back now. And a lot of times, I mean, at age 20 and even at age 30, that's a difficult concept, but are you living in a way that's concordant with who you are? Are you maintaining your core values? And I think those are the big questions we can ask at any age. Self-regulation. We're back to that, I know. I promise you we're going to keep talking about it, right? So self-regulation is, think about it, the cyclical phases of self-regulation. Self-reflection, so self-monitoring, self-evaluation, I see where I am, and then through forethought, I set goals, I develop implementation intentions, and remember, that was kind of the culmination of the chapter on goal setting, right? And then this yields a performance, and once I've committed the performance, then I look back, self-reflection, self-monitoring, self-evaluation, and I say, you know, pretty good job there. So it involves the person's, this is metacognitive, that is thinking about thinking, this overt awareness, right, of how the goal setting process is going, how it's leading to goal attainment, are the goals concordant with my value system, all these elements. Now, metacognition, thinking about thinking, I know it's a fancy term, but think about it. Some people just don't think about themselves like that. But we started at the beginning of the lecture talking about William James, and I think this is what facilitates it. I've got the I who observes the me. So the I is up here somewhere observing Mark and his performance, right? And it allows me to self-reflect. It allows me to self-monitor. It allows me to self-evaluate, and that it instructs. So Mark up here instructs Mark as to improve his performance or how to behave in a way that's more concordant with the self-values. So it represents a more complex self-view, a more robust self-view, and a more useful self-view. Annika, I don't mean to, I'm not going to insult Annika, but Annika's in the moment, and she's in the moment all the time. When we think of I and me, I don't know that that exists for Annika. She's all me. And we know, interestingly though, that many people live as though they're all me and don't have maybe a self-awareness, right? Not that it bugs you, right? Because you are you. Let's listen to a video. I'm going to take this off and I'm going to put it behind here where the speakers are. And this is pretty cool. So this is going to be Walter Mischel, and he's going to be talking to us about a very, very famous study. You guys will know this study, right? And then that'll lead us into our homework. So let's listen to Walter Mischel. I believe this is the Charlie Rose interview show, great show, and they always have a panel every week, a different panel, and one of the people on the panel is a relatively famous actor. See if you recognize him.
Right, let me begin with Walter Mischel and talk about, what do we know about brain development that bears on public policy?
Well, I think for me, Charlie, the part about brain development that bears tremendously on public policy, and that I think is the best news that people who care about the potential of human beings to develop well have had in a very long time, is the amazing plasticity of the human brain. The plasticity of the human brain is tremendous, and it's particularly great in the first few years of life. And something quite miraculous happens when one watches normal human development in the period that starts with birth and goes to 5, 6 or so years. It's a transformation that I became aware of before there was a brain science. It's a transformation I watched in my own 3 daughters as they went from being what kids are at birth, which is completely tied to their own sensations, completely dependent on caregivers, to becoming potentially distractible by the time they're 6 months old and learning to distract themselves in ways that could give relief to their own emotional distress, that is, they could begin to calm themselves, to something really extraordinary that happens between 2 and 5. And what happens between 2 and 5 is that they're able to begin to inhibit impulses, to delay gratification, to keep a goal in mind, to use working memory to keep going, to shift their attention in extraordinary ways. And that's really what the basis became for the study that I did that's now referred to. Eric talked about it as the Marshmallow Experiment.
A wonderful experiment.
What happened in the Marshmallow Experiment?
Although it's referred to as the Marshmallow Experiment, it actually isn't always marshmallows. Very often it's Oreo cookies, or it could be tiny little pretzel sticks. But the point is, it's very small rewards that are pitted against each other that the child has chosen from a whole bunch. So what you're seeing in this picture is a little girl who's chosen to wait for 2 Oreo cookies rather than 1 immediately, and she knows that at any time she can ring that bell, the experimenter will come back into the room, and she will, if she rings the bell, she'll get the 1 Oreo cookie, but she'll forgo the 2. On the other hand, if she waits for the lady to come back by herself and doesn't ring the bell, and doesn't begin nibbling on the cookie, she gets the 2.
Right.
That's the experiment.
Let me make sure that I understand this correctly. So she gets 1 cookie, and then the instruction is that if you don't eat this cookie right away. If you can hold on for a while, then you will have a chance to get a second cookie.
It's even simpler. Before she starts, the little girl has already made a choice. She's taken what she would like to have,
Right.
which is cookies, and she's been told, would you like the one or would you like the two of the cookies? And she's decided she would like the two. So what she understands now and what is practiced with the stuff right in front of her, both the two cookies that she gets if she waits, the one cookie that she can have immediately, is that it's entirely up to her. At any time she can ring the bring me back bell. The experimenter jumps back into the room and it's hers. So
only one, not the other.
then she gets only one and not the two. That's the experiment. The
Right.
simplicity
Right.
itself. I've always
Right.
believed that it's important to be able to eat your methodology. and so
I feel like marshmallows.
yeah. So that's that's the study. Now, the important thing about it is it provided us with an opportunity to do experiments on how does the representation of the object of desire, of the thing you want, like the two cookies, make it possible to do this delay thing, to make it possible for a child as young as 4 years old to be able to wait 15 minutes in a room that's deliberately barren, that's deliberately stripped. There are no distractors. She's got nothing to entertain herself with. What we found here that was surprising was that as these children at Stanford, where these studies began, were growing up, it became clear that they were different in ways that actually connected to how long they were able to wait initially. And I began to do follow-up work to see if we could find correlations between how long the child waited in this situation at age 4 or 5 and what was happening to them when they were young adolescents, when they were 12 years old, 13 years old, and so on. And that was the beginning. And we found to our surprise that beginning in adolescence, there were very strong correlations, much larger than we had any reason to anticipate, between seconds of delay time and outcomes that were very important, including at age 16 and 17. Their scores on the Scholastic Aptitude Test, which are very important for admission to college in the United States, including things like ratings by parents and teachers of their social and cognitive competence in adolescence, and including a whole set of things that became increasingly clear when we were following them at age 32. And that included less tendency to develop a large body mass index, less tendency towards obesity, less cocaine drug use, and so on.
Walter, you make me think about public policy right away. If these tests are so predictive of future behavior, if it appears that a kid who can delay gratification for those 15 minutes turns out to get better SAT scores, to do better at a job later in life even, how would ordinary people in the public be reassured that such a test at such an early age wouldn't brand the kid for life?
Particularly the kids who don't do well on this.
That's what I'm thinking. The kids who don't do well.
Yeah.
Or do we then have kind of self-fulfilling prophecies about these kids that will sort of trail them all through their lives? What reassurance would they have?
So the idea of being frozen in the position on the measure is completely off. We're talking about correlations that are significant. We're not talking about a destiny for an individual. So I want to be very clear that a branding would be completely missing the point, particularly since the most exciting findings about the Marshmallow experiments are the ease with which it is possible to change an individual's ability to delay gratification.
And there are ways to do that.
There are very straightforward ways to do it that connect with how the brain works. In the experiments we've done, we've taken children who were unable to wait for more than a minute and suggested to them before we leave the room, if you want to, when you want to, you can make believe that this stuff in front of you is just a picture. Put a frame around it in your head. And the child understands that, knows what a picture is, knows how to put a frame around it in the head. And the moment that that happens, you walk out of the room, the child is able to wait 15 minutes. You show the child the picture of the object, and you say, make believe it's real. Okay? And the child rings the bell within a minute or two.
Wow.
So these experiments, which get virtually no attention in the media, are really the thing that has such, I think, tremendous public policy implications, because it means you can teach this. And you can teach it exactly in the earliest years of life. You can teach it in preschool. You can use the remarkable imagination, the amazing imagination that kids have at that age to utilize the imagination and to do a whole variety of things that kids who are able to do this, in fact, illustrate vividly and beautifully. So that's why I think the interpretation to be taken from the findings is that this is an enormously important skill. It has predictive qualities, it has protective effects, but it is teachable, it is changeable, it is contextualized, and even individuals who are very high at delayability are strikingly unable to delay under some circumstances, etc., as we know from all the fallen heroes in the headlines.
All right.
Well, what do you guys think? Is that freaking amazing or not? I think it's wonderful to get to hear Walter Mischel speak about his own research, something that the marshmallow test has kind of become a household term, if you will. And isn't it refreshing to hear that no, those of you who are entity theorists, remember entity theory, you say, hey, you're born with it or you're not. And Mischel is obviously an incremental theorist. He says, look, this can be taught, this can be trained, this can be developed over time. And that's the good news for us in terms of self-regulation. Yeah, maybe it's almost impossible for us to resist ringing that bell so we can have that one cookie right now, but it's teachable. And notice that Mischel refers to this idea of cognitive reframing, essentially. I mean, almost quite literally, by putting a picture frame around it and reframing it as a picture rather than as an actual object. So part of the creativity for us then is to determine how we can do this in different contexts to enhance our self-regulatory abilities. So that being said, that's where we're going to go with the assignment. I also think this is tremendously pertinent to our current situation in the pandemic. That some people can successfully delay gratification. They say, I'm not going to go out to dinner. You know, I mean, I'll admit, my wife and I have not been out to dinner since last March. We're going on a year. We're going to be a year in about 3 weeks. And, you know, she gets on social media and or talks to her friends, and they say, yeah, going out to dinner, etc. But it's like, well, you know, we're under pandemic. We have some friends who decided they were going to drive across the country for 8 weeks, right? Stopping everywhere, mid-pandemic. And it's like, well, I understand that you want a vacation. I'd love to have a vacation as well. But notice it's a self-regulatory process that says, you know, it's probably not a good time. Now, before we begin to, you know, descend into an argument, well, the pandemic is a hoax, or it's not that bad, or I'm safe, or all this other stuff, notice many of those conversations can be little more than dissonance reduction, as we talked about earlier. That is, we provide rationale to make what we did okay, whether we actually believe it's okay or not. And this is also known as motivated reasoning. This is a topic that we'll get to later in the course. And I was fortunate to have worked with Dr. Pete Ditto at University of California, Irvine when I was undergraduate there working in his lab. And we researched motivated reasoning. And people can create explanations to rationalize just about anything they do. No big mystery. Freud has been talking about that, you know, since the beginning of time. Regardless, self-regulation, let's look at the bottom line. Self-regulation can be improved. It can be taught. And it has payoffs. And it has significant payoffs in the success people experience later in life, right? So we got a couple issues working there. Self-concordance has been really big in this last part, and self-regulation. So if we choose wisely and we choose our environments, right, then we can enhance our self-regulatory capabilities. And that brings us to homework 6. So, we got implementation intentions, we got monitoring, we got self-evaluation as the components of self-regulation. Here's a chance for us to practice it. You can see in this table, right, what is the goal? So we set a goal. I need to learn 3 new motivational concepts from Chapter 8. I know. What a hokey example, right? Implementation intention. Well, that's my goal. How the hell am I going to do it? I have to have a plan, right? So, goal without a plan is just a wish, as we talked before. So, implementation from 7 to 10 p.m., I'm going to read chapter and take notes. And taking notes while one is reading is often one of the best ways to really kind of internalize the material that one has read. Now, that's my implementation intention. How am I going to tell how I'm doing? How am I going to verify myself? How am I going to hold my feet to the fire, right? I'm going to identify the 3 motivational concepts in the notes taken, right? So I want 3 motivational concepts internalized from Chapter 8. This is how I'm going to do it. This is how I'm going to know that I'm doing it. And this is the I kind of holding the me's feet to the fire, if you will. And then the self-evaluation, that is, did I do it well? Did I do it sufficiently? Because if we just half-ass it, it's like, let's not fool ourselves, because the only self we're fooling is ourselves, right? Critique quality of the notes to see that one really understands the concepts. Am I clear that I really understand this from looking at my own notes? And that, again, self-evaluation. But let's take it to a physical. How many people like to play tennis? Okay. Well, if you like to play tennis, you know, landing a serve becomes an integral component of the game, at least successfully playing the game of tennis. So my goal is to land 70% of first serves. This Thursday, what am I going to do? This is my plan. I'm going to hit 100 serves at the university courts. And then I'm going to write down on a notepad the number of serves in or out. So I'm just going to keep track. And if you're really good, then you just count the misses, right? Because that's a shorter list, or it's an easier count. And then critique. Critique the performance as conforming to the goal. And notice, this is a great type of competition. This is my favorite competition, when we compete with the self. And we demonstrate to ourselves legitimate, verifiable self-improvement. Now, increase tips by 20%. So let's say I'm working as a server, doing DoorDash, whatever it is. This is one of my favorite techniques. Let's suppose I'm a server in a restaurant, and I say, you know, the way you... How many of you have been servers in restaurants? All right? Do you believe that the way you greet a table can affect the amount of tip you receive? And if you believe that, then you might develop 4 different greetings. And you randomly assign one of the 4 greetings for every table that you serve within that given week. And then you record the amount of tips for each greeting. So you get on your way to a table, you pull, you know, a little slip out of your paper. You have 4 slips of paper in your pocket that are numbered 1 through 4. You mix them up, you pull one out and say greeting 3, you do your tip, right? You do your service, and then you record the amount of tip for greeting 3, and then you do this. And maybe at the end of the week, you've served, let's say, 40 tables. 10 with greeting 1, 10 with greeting 2, 10 with greeting 3. Samples getting large enough to draw a meaningful average. And then you look at the averages. What were the average tips per greeting? How well did it work, right? And critique the greeting effectiveness by computing the average tip for each greeting. I'm a big fan of creating our evaluation to empirical evidence. That is something countable. Anyway, so for homework 6, I think you're going to find this assignment straightforward. Beyond that, it may give you the power beyond what you believed you possessed. That is, we may be able to improve our goal setting, our goal monitoring, our goal evaluation, choosing goals that are self-concordant, and giving us a system to develop greater levels of self-regulation. These are potential benefits, right? At its core is mindfulness, though, as much of the content of the course actually is, and I probably don't discuss mindfulness enough. When we become mindful of the motivational process or technique, and this is what putting it on paper does, right, sweetie? Penelope, are you just losing your kitty mind right now? All right. We begin to own a greater portion of who we are and how we operate in our life. So we increase our perceived locus of causality, that is, we increase our internal locus of control, we become more autonomous, we begin to call our shots to a greater and greater extent. So here we go from goal setting to evaluation with implementation intentions and monitoring as waypoints on the path to accomplishment. And hopefully they're self-concordant goals so that we get that psychological benefit as a result of carrying them out. So in the example table below, there's 3 self-assigned goals. We know the goals without a plan are little more than wishes. So there you go. We had our example. Let's create a list of 3 goals for yourself. Note, more specific the goal, the more aplomb with which it can be achieved. So specific goals are superior to less specific goals. And notice, the goals in the example were amazingly specific. So that's the best way to go. From the goal, create an implementation intention. How the goal is going to be accomplished. Again, more specific, the better. Vague implementation intentions are an effective way to weasel out of accomplishing our goals. So if you see yourself committing these kind of loosey-goosey, unverifiable goals, then maybe we shouldn't expect to succeed under that circumstance. Third step is monitoring our progress. Monitoring keeps us on track, provides us feedback. Yep, to become self-actualized, to become self-congruent, to become authentic, we must be responsible to ourselves. And we're worth this effort. There is no one in your skin more worth this effort than you. So be honest, be kind, be harsh, be whatever it takes. But through this process, you will become increasingly authentic and increasingly autonomous, have increased self-regulatory powers. Fourth is going to be the self-evaluation. Requires you to be honest. What greater crime to ourselves than to lie to ourselves? Let's face it, right? It's okay to fail. It's okay to backslide. This happens all the time. Not all the time. It happens some of the time. And you're going to find as you hold yourself accountable, the backsliding and the failure will diminish over time, right? It's worth doing. It must be at least moderately challenging. Remember, if it doesn't challenge you, it doesn't change you. Pithy little quote, right? And moderately reflects our own appraisal of who we are at a given time. With the self as an object of continuous improvement, we become a most interesting object of self-scrutiny. That is, as we watch ourselves improve, we challenge ourselves, we watch ourselves rise to the occasion, and we can verify it and we can talk about it in detail because of the specificity of the goal setting, right? Then we become this fascinating object of potential self-improvement, continuous improvement throughout our lifetime. And I believe that we're worth that effort. And I hope you believe that you're worth that effort as well. So enough of this. Homework 6, I'm hoping is straightforward. You got the example. You know where to find it by now. Let us say goodbye for now. And we're going to say, we're going to allow Boots to take us out of there. So Boots, I think she's senior member of the household now as far as cats go. And she's a handful. She makes herself known. Anyway, Boots, we'll see you later. Penelope, you want to say goodbye to everybody? All right. You guys have a great day.